Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we're taking a closer look at something that's been in the news a lot lately, American progressivism.
It's definitely a hot topic, especially when you see those parallels with
Right.
with
Well,
today.
but before we get too ahead of ourselves, I think it's important for us to kind of go back to the source material and really understand what progressivism actually was. I think a lot of times we throw that word around without really knowing.
Absolutely, and I think this deep dive is going to be really illuminating
Yeah.
for listeners who are interested in understanding, where some of those modern parallels come from.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What exactly was progressivism? What did these reformers believe in?
Well, at its heart, the progressive era, which spanned roughly from the 1890s to the 1920s,
Okay.
was a period of immense social and political upheaval in America. You have to remember, this was a time of rapid industrialization,
Right.
unprecedented immigration, and growing economic inequality. And in response to all of this, you have this really diverse group of reformers who, came from all walks of life: journalists, academics, social workers, politicians, even business leaders.
That is diverse.
Yeah, and that they're all kind of united by this shared belief that society could and should be improved. They're very optimistic,
Oh, that's so interesting. So it's not just like one.
not a monolith,
Yeah.
not at all.
It's just people trying to.
Yeah, a real melting pot of ideas.
Okay, so what were some of the core principles that kind of united this diverse group of reformers?
Well, one of the big ones was a deep skepticism of laissez-faire capitalism.
Okay.
The idea that the government should just stay out of the economy and let the market forces do their thing.
Like a hands-off approach.
Exactly. Progressives, they saw the downsides of that approach firsthand. They saw the poverty, the exploitation of workers, the monopolies,
Right.
crushing small businesses. So they believed that government intervention was necessary to address those problems. They weren't socialists.
Yeah.
They weren't trying to overthrow capitalism, but they definitely believed in regulating it,
So tweaking it,
tweaking it, yeah,
making
and they're
it
more
space
fair and just
for everybody.
exactly.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
And this kind of ties into another key principle, a rejection of social Darwinism,
Right.
which was this, really popular idea at the time
Yeah.
that basically applied Darwin's theory of evolution
To people.
to society. Yeah,
Just the
very flawed application.
Right.
And it led to these, very harmful beliefs
Yeah.
about some people being inherently superior to others, whether it's based on race, class, whatever.
Okay, so they're pushing back against that.
Huge pushback. They believed that everyone deserved a fair chance in life and that society had a responsibility to help those who were struggling.
Interesting.
That was a big part of their philosophy.
Okay, so we're starting to see those core tenets emerge. Now, one group that played a really crucial role in exposing these injustices that you're talking about were the muckrakers, right?
Oh, the muckrakers, yeah. They were a fascinating bunch. Basically, these were investigative journalists
Okay.
who went undercover, often at great personal risk, to expose the corruption, the greed, the exploitation that was happening all around them. And their work was incredibly influential in galvanizing public support for reform.
Oh, for sure. And they weren't afraid to, make enemies. I mean, they were going after some pretty powerful people.
No, they were fearless. And you see this reflected in some of the amazing pieces of journalism that came out of that era. Ida Tarbell's expose on Standard Oil,
Oh, yeah.
Lincoln Steffen's The Shame of the Cities.
Yeah, and how can we forget Upton Sinclair's The Jungle? I mean, that book
Oh, boy.
really shook things up.
That one went straight for the stomach.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he vividly portrayed those horrific conditions in the meatpacking industry, and it's directly led to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act of 1906.
Huge wins for consumer protection.
Massive.
Yeah, and, Sinclair famously said, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident, I hit it in the stomach."
Well, he certainly hit something.
He did. And it really underscores the power of investigative journalism, right?
Absolutely. So this idea that knowledge
Yeah, that informed citizens
is important.
were essential to a functioning democracy.
Right, because if you don't know what's going on,
You can't make informed decisions.
you can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
So they really believed in that power of education and information.
Oh, absolutely. And that's why you also see this rise of the social gospel movement and settlement houses during this time.
Okay, so let's talk about those. What was the social gospel all about?
Well, the social gospel was really this fascinating fusion of religion and social activism. It was this idea that Christians had a moral duty to address social problems like poverty, inequality, and injustice.
So not just focusing on your own salvation.
It was about putting your faith into action.
Right, putting your faith into action.
Yeah. And this movement was really influential in shaping the progressive agenda. You see this in the emergence of organizations like the Salvation Army,
Okay.
which is still around today, of course,
Yeah.
and the Women's Christian Temperance Union,
The WCTU.
which played a major role in the Prohibition movement.
Right, right. And then you have these settlement houses that you mentioned.
Yeah, so settlement houses were these community centers
Okay.
that were established mostly in poor urban neighborhoods
To help.
to help, yeah,
Okay.
especially immigrants who were often struggling to adjust to life in America. And one of the most famous examples of a settlement house was Hull House,
Okay.
founded by Jane Addams in Chicago in 1889.
I've heard of Hull House.
Yeah, it was a model for settlement houses across the country.
Okay.
And what was so remarkable about Hull House was the sheer range of services they offered.
Oh, really?
It wasn't just like a soup kitchen or a place to get a bed for the night.
Yeah.
It was like a one-stop shop for everything from, basic necessities like bathhouses and playgrounds to educational opportunities.
Wow.
Like kindergartens and daycare and even job training and legal aid.
Oh, wow.
So it was really this holistic approach.
It sounds like it.
Yeah, to community building and empowerment.
It was community, wasn't it?
It was. And I think for a lot of immigrants, these settlement houses were like a lifeline.
Yeah.
They helped them to adapt to American society, to learn English, to thrive,
Yeah.
and to build better lives for themselves and their families.
So we're starting to see a lot of those different facets of the progressive movement, this belief in government as a force for good, the importance of investigative journalism,
Yeah,
and the role of these social and religious organizations.
absolutely. And it's a reminder that, this was a really complex movement with a lot of different players and different motivations.
Right. And you mentioned earlier that there were some darker sides to this era.
Oh, yes. Progressivism wasn't all sunshine and roses.
Let's dig into that then.
Yeah, we got to dig into it. And one of those darker sides was the influence of social Darwinism.
Yeah, we were just talking about that.
And it's really disturbing offshoot the eugenics movement.
Right, because for all the good that progressives did, they also, some of them, held some views that we would consider, pretty problematic today.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, social Darwinism, with its idea that certain races or classes were inherently superior to others,
Right.
it really fueled a lot of prejudice and discrimination during this time.
Yeah. And then you have eugenics, which took that idea to a whole other level.
And eugenics was terrifying.
Yeah.
It basically aimed to improve the human race through selective breeding.
Through selective breeding.
Yeah, like controlling who could reproduce and who couldn't.
So are we talking forced sterilizations and things like that?
Unfortunately, yes. There were actually forced sterilization laws enacted in several states,
Yeah.
targeting people who were deemed unfit
Unfair.
to reproduce. And it wasn't just limited to people with disabilities.
So who else were they targeting?
They also targeted people from certain racial and ethnic groups, immigrants, poor people, criminals.
It's just horrifying.
It's a really dark chapter in American history.
Yeah.
And it's especially jarring to see it happening alongside all of this talk about progress and reform.
Right. It's this weird contradiction, isn't it?
It is. And it really underscores the fact that progress isn't linear.
Right. That's a good point. It's not like this straight line from bad to good.
Nope. It's messy and complicated, and there are always these, blind spots and contradictions.
Yeah. And you see this even in figures like Margaret Sanger.
Oh, Sanger is a fascinating, controversial figure.
Yeah.
I mean, on the one hand, she was a pioneer of the birth control movement.
Which was a huge step forward for women's rights.
Absolutely. She believed that women should have control over their own bodies and their own reproductive choices.
Which at the time was pretty radical.
Oh, it was incredibly radical for her time. But on the other hand, some of her views on population control and eugenics
were problematic, to say the least.
To say the least, yeah. She did express some pretty disturbing ideas about limiting the reproduction of certain groups.
It's so difficult to reconcile these, progressive views with...
Yeah, the eugenics stuff.
Yeah,
It's a reminder that even those who fight for positive change can still be influenced by the prejudices of their time.
Right. It's that whole thing, that we're all products of our time.
We are. So what can you tell us about the role of labor unions during this time?
Well, they were definitely at the forefront of the fight for workers' rights.
Right.
The Socialist Party, led by Eugene V. Debs,
Yes, very charismatic.
gained a lot of traction during this time.
Yes, they did.
They advocated for policies like free college and, improvements to working conditions and even public ownership of major industries.
Yeah, it was pretty radical.
Yeah, and I imagine those ideas didn't always gain mainstream support,
No, they didn't.
but they did play a key role in pushing for, some really important reforms.
Yeah.
And then there were some, tragic events that happened that really helped kind of galvanize public support for these reforms.
Absolutely.
You're talking about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire of 1911.
Exactly.
Which is a story that I think still haunts us to this day.
Yeah, it's a horrific incident.
Yeah, over 140 garment workers
Mostly young women.
perished in a fire due to unsafe working conditions.
That's right.
It really exposed the brutal realities of, factory life in America.
Yes.
And the public outcry that followed helped spur the passage of these groundbreaking worker safety laws.
Especially in New York,
Okay.
thanks to the work of Tammany Hall Democrats.
It's just a sobering reminder of the human cost of unchecked industrialization and, really how crucial labor unions were in protecting workers' rights.
Absolutely.
And speaking of rights, the progressive era also saw the emergence of the new woman.
Right.
What did that term even signify, and how did it connect to this growing feminist movement?
So the new woman represented this shift in societal expectations and opportunities for women.
Okay.
They were pursuing higher education, they were delaying marriage, they were entering the workforce.
Right.
And they were challenging those traditional notions of femininity.
And this newfound independence and empowerment, I imagine, that really fueled the fight for women's suffrage.
Absolutely.
Because, even with all these other reforms going on, women were still denied that basic right to vote.
Yes.
So tell me more about the suffrage movement and the role of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, or NASA.
So NASI was the leading organization fighting for women's right to vote.
Okay.
And they mobilized millions of women across the country.
Wow.
And their efforts culminated in the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920.
A truly landmark achievement.
Absolutely. But it's important to remember that the fight for full gender equality didn't end there.
Right.
Even within the suffrage movement, there were different opinions about what true equality actually meant.
Yeah, some like Alice Paul
Right.
argued for a constitutional amendment to guarantee, full legal protection.
Yes.
And prohibit all forms of discrimination based on sex. Others felt that the right to vote was enough.
Yeah.
It really shows that even within a movement that's dedicated to, a single cause, you can still have this diversity of perspectives and goals.
Yeah.
And this diversity of thought is also reflected in the wide range of political reforms that progressives championed.
Yeah.
And, they really aim to make the government more responsive to the people, less susceptible to corruption.
Yeah.
So what were some of the specific reforms that they were pushing for?
They advocated for things like the direct election of senators.
Yeah, we take that for granted now.
I know, right?
But at the time, that was revolutionary.
It was revolutionary, and it was achieved through the 17th Amendment in 1913.
Okay.
But before that, senators were chosen by state legislatures,
Right.
often influenced by special interests and political machines.
Yeah, it's fascinating how many of the reforms we consider so essential to democracy today
Right.
were so radical back then.
They really were.
What other measures did they champion?
So they also pushed for initiatives and referendums,
Okay.
which allowed citizens to propose and vote directly on legislation.
Wow, so bypassing the legislature
Yes.
entirely.
Exactly.
Wow.
And then there were recall elections,
Okay.
which empowered voters to remove corrupt or incompetent officials from office before their terms ended.
So they could really hold them accountable?
Exactly.
Wow.
And they fought for secret ballots
Okay.
to protect voters from intimidation
Right.
and direct primaries to weaken the power of party bosses.
So it was really about trying to empower ordinary citizens.
Absolutely.
And make the government more accountable to the
Yes.
people.
Yeah.
It sounds like they were really trying to shift the balance of power,
Right.
away from these, elite interests towards ordinary people.
Exactly.
But even as these progressive reforms were sweeping the nation, America was still deeply divided along racial lines.
Yes, unfortunately.
So what was happening with the fight for racial equality during this time?
Well, it's a complex story,
Oh.
marked by both progress and setbacks.
Sure.
You had figures like Booker T. Washington,
Mm-hmm.
who believed in a more gradual approach to racial equality, emphasizing, economic self-sufficiency and vocational education for African Americans.
But I imagine that his approach wasn't accepted by everybody.
You're absolutely right.
Paul?
W.E.B. Du Bois,
Okay.
a Harvard-educated sociologist, challenged Washington's approach,
Okay.
arguing that African Americans should strive for full social and political equality.
Including access to higher education.
Yes, and he was one of the founders of the NAACP,
Mm-hmm.
the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People.
Which continues to fight for racial justice today.
It does.
It's a reminder that progress isn't always, a straight line,
Right.
and that different groups can have very different ideas about how to achieve equality.
Absolutely.
And speaking of complex figures, I think it's time we talk about Theodore Roosevelt,
Okay.
a president who's often associated with the progressive era. What can you tell us about his presidency and how it kind of shaped this period of reform?
So Roosevelt was this fascinating and complex figure. He
Oh.
was a Republican,
Mm-hmm.
but he embraced a lot of these progressive ideals,
Mm-hmm.
particularly when it came to conservation and corporate control.
Okay.
His Square Deal
Right.
focused on three key areas:
Okay.
conservation of natural resources,
Mm-hmm.
control of corporations,
Okay.
and consumer protection.
So what did he actually do to kind of put those ideals into practice?
Yeah.
I mean, we always hear about his trust busting, but what were some specific examples of his actions?
Well, one of his most famous acts was taking on J.P. Morgan's Northern Securities Company,
Okay.
which was this massive railroad monopoly
Mm-hmm.
that controlled just a huge portion of the American rail system.
So he was going after some big players.
He was. Roosevelt's administration filed suit under the Sherman Antitrust Act,
Mm-hmm.
and the Supreme Court ultimately ruled in favor of the government,
Okay.
breaking up the monopoly.
Wow.
So this sent a powerful message to corporate America
Yeah.
that Roosevelt was serious about curbing the power of big business.
Wow. So he wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo.
He was not.
What about his other areas of focus, like conservation and consumer protection?
Yeah, so he was deeply passionate about preserving America's natural heritage.
Okay.
He believed that we had a moral obligation to protect our natural resources for future generations.
That's a powerful idea.
It is.
Yeah.
And so, he established the U.S. Forest Service.
Okay.
He significantly expanded the system of national parks and national forests.
Mm-hmm.
He signed the Antiquities Act,
Okay.
giving presidents the power to designate national monuments
Yeah.
to protect areas of historical, scientific, or cultural significance.
So, when I'm hiking through a national park or marveling at the beauty of a protected wilderness area, I should really be thanking Teddy Roosevelt and the progressives for their foresight. It's amazing to think that, their actions over a century ago are still impacting our lives today.
It's incredible.
And it wasn't just about protecting pristine wilderness.
Right.
He also saw the importance of managing, our natural resources responsibly and sustainably.
Absolutely.
It's remarkable to think about how much he accomplished in just a few years.
It is.
Did his successors continue this progressive agenda?
Well, to varying degrees, yes.
Okay.
William Howard Taft Roosevelt's hand-picked successor
Okay.
was perhaps even more aggressive
Wow.
in enforcing antitrust laws.
Okay.
He successfully broke up Standard Oil,
Right.
John D. Rockefeller's massive oil monopoly.
That must send shockwaves through corporate America.
It did, but Taft was also a bit less charismatic than Roosevelt,
Okay.
and he faced opposition from within his own party,
Okay.
which led to a split in the Republican Party.
So it wasn't all smooth sailing?
No, it wasn't.
Yeah.
Roosevelt ended up forming his own progressive party,
Right.
also known as the Bull Moose Party, to challenge Taft in the 1912 election.
Which I'm guessing didn't end well for either of them.
You're right.
Yeah.
Their rivalry really paved the way for the election of Woodrow Wilson,
Okay.
a Democrat who also embraced many progressive ideals.
Okay.
So Wilson campaigned on his New Freedom agenda,
Okay.
which aimed to break up monopolies, promote competition, and reduce the influence of big business in government.
So in a way, he was kind of carrying the torch
That
of
is-
progressivism,
Yeah,
but I know that he also had a darker side,
fortunately, yes.
especially when it comes to race relations.
That's true. Despite his progressive reforms, Wilson held these deeply racist views,
Yeah.
even screening the notoriously racist film The Birth of a Nation at the White House.
That's a shocking detail.
It is.
It really goes to show that even those who champion progressive causes
Mm,
can be blinded by prejudice.
absolutely.
It's a stark reminder that progress is rarely simple or straightforward.
Right.
And even those who advocate for positive change can fall short of their ideals. Well, this has certainly been an illuminating conversation so far.
Yeah.
We've explored, the highs and lows of the progressive era,
Yes.
these inspiring figures, but also some of these really troubling ideas
Hmm.
that shaped this really pivotal period in American history.
Yes.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the progressive era.
It's been my pleasure.
I hope you found it as informative and thought-provoking as I have.
Me too.
And until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a more just and equitable world.